Welcome to our session about AdoptOpenJDK, making Java free again. I'm Hendrik Ebbers, and with me is George Adams. So since we do not have much time today, only 30 minutes, let's do a very quick introduction. So I'm Hendrik. I'm from Germany, from Dortmund. I'm working for a company that is called Karakun. I'm one of the co-leaders, and I do a lot of Java-related things. I'm a Java 1 rockstar, Java champion, and since last year, I'm part of the technical steering committee of AdoptOpenJDK. And yeah, and I directly hand over to George. George, you are muted. Are you muted?
Okay, right. Thanks, Hendrik. Okay. It's always hard to follow up behind Hendrik with his great credentials, but I'll give it a go. My name's George Adams. I'm a Java program manager at Microsoft. I'm one of the co-founders of AdoptOpenJDK and sit on the technical steering committee alongside Hendrik and others from several companies. I also dive into a few other sort of open source projects. I'm a core collaborator at the Node.js Foundation, and I am also a Foundation Bootstrap team member at the OpenJSF. I believe, yep. So Hendrik, are you going to? I know it's me. So what are we going to cover? So we're going to do a very sort of quick dive into the sort of terminology. Hopefully sort of short and sweet, but there's a few kind of confusing terms along the way. Hendrik's got some really exciting diagrams that will sort of walk you through the OpenJDK workflow. We're going to cover vendor distribution and the differences between each vendor. And then we're going to dive straight into AdoptOpenJDK. We'll do a bit on the history of it. We'll talk about Eclipse Adoptium, which we're obviously very excited to talk about, particularly here. And then we're going to sort of roll things off with the build and test and look at how we kind of do those on a day-to-day basis. So I think next slide, please, Hendrik. Thank you. So to sort of briefly cover terminology, as I mentioned earlier, there's three key terms in this deck that we want everybody to understand. The first one is OpenJDK. OpenJDK is incredibly commonly confused with an OpenJDK binary. It is not a binary. The OpenJDK project itself is a reference implementation only. It is only source. It essentially provides us with the Java SE standard today. And if you were to download OpenJDK, you would be downloading an OpenJDK binary, which is a Java development kit built directly from the OpenJDK source code. And then last but not least, we have an OpenJDK provider. Now, I guess most commonly known, Oracle would be deemed a vendor with their Oracle Java, but there's several others out there that Hendrik's going to cover later on. But a provider is anybody that just moves and takes that source code and turns it into their own binary, essentially. So I believe it's back to Hendrik.
Yep. So yeah, as George mentioned, so while there's only one OpenJDK, which is more or less the source of Java, there are several OpenJDK binaries, so built out of the OpenJDK, and a lot of OpenJDK providers. So here you can see some of them. We have different Linux distributions that provide OpenJDK builds in their repositories. We have companies like Azul, for example, or Bellsoft that provide OpenJDK builds and even provide commercial support for them. We have companies like Amazon that offer Corretto or Red Hat and SAP who provide builds to, or for example, Alibaba. So all of them are based on the OpenJDK, and a lot of them are evolved within the last years. And this is somehow related to changes that happened in Java or in the OpenJDK within the last years. And one big thing here is the new Java release train that most of you might know already. And what we are seeing here on this slide is not the general Java release train, but the Oracle JDK release train. So the release train that Oracle announced at the, it was not Java 1 anymore, it was Code 1 some years ago, and what you have seen on a lot of slides from Oracle. So with this new release train, we will get updates for Java, major releases for Java every 6 months. So 2 major releases each year. And some of them are so-called LTS releases, which means long-term support releases. Here in this slide, you can see Java 8 and Java 11, which are LTS releases. Java 17 will be the next one. While all the intermediate releases between the LTS releases only stay for half a year, which means like after half a year, there is no chance to get updates for them when talking about Oracle. To be true, for example, Azure even provide some support over 6 months for those. But in general, when you want to have a longer support than 6 months, you stay on the LTS releases of Java. And while everybody's talking about the LTS releases and say, okay, from Java 8, you go to 11, then maybe to 17. For a lot of people, it's not quite easy to understand the licenses behind that and what you are allowed to use. Because when talking, for example, from the Oracle JDK that you can download in the Oracle Technical Network, where you downloaded your Java binaries for years for Java 6, 7, 8, and so on, all the binaries that you can download there for Java 8 and Java 11 have changed the license, and you're not allowed anymore to use them in commercial applications without buying support at Oracle. So this is what you can see on the slide. This changed for Java 8 last year, and for Java 11 and up, you are not allowed to use it in production anyway, and the LTS versions, so builds after half a year, even for the LTS versions, happens only internally for commercial customers. But as we've already seen, there are a lot of more companies that provide Java binaries. So let's have a look how those are created based on the OpenJDK and what are the differences between those companies. So to do so, I will give you an introduction to the OpenJDK workflows. And this is really minimized. So this is not the real workflow, how developers work in the OpenJDK. This is just as simple as possible to give you an idea how this is working. So let's assume the OpenJDK as a repository, and in the bottom we see the history of the OpenJDK as, for example, a master branch in Git or something like that. And we have changes that will be added to the OpenJDK. Some of them are new features, which are the green bubbles, and some are security fixes. And as you can see on this image, whenever we create a new release by, for example, in this image shown as a release branch, all the security fixes that are happening in the master, so in the ongoing version, are migrated to the release versions. So, and this is what you know, right? For Java 7, for Java 6, for Java 8, you received updates that do not contain, or normally do not contain any new functionality, but contains a lot of security fixes to let you use this Java version over a long time period. But for all these versions, even for Java 6 and for Java 7, there was a point where the free and open maintenance of those versions stops. And this is where companies come in and provide commercial LTS support. And what those companies are doing in such case is that they, let's say, like they copy the sources from the OpenJDK into a private repository, and then internally in those private repositories continue to work on the Java version. In this case, for example, Java 8. So this is not only Oracle, there are a lot of vendors who do this. We've already seen some on the earlier slides, like, for example, Bellsoft or Azure. And what those companies are doing is to offer support to their customers that are paying for the support. They took security fixes that are happening in the OpenJDK and migrate them to their private and closed source repositories. And based on this, they can build OpenJDK binaries for their customers. So since most of the security fixes are not that easy to merge, and from time to time, I mean, when we talk about Java 6, for example, LTS support, commercial LTS support, and we have a fix in OpenJDK that already uses lambdas and things like that, you cannot just merge this fix, so you need to re-implement it from time to time. And based on this, it can really happen now that this closed repositories from the vendors are moving into different directions. Maybe vendor A has solved the security fix a little bit different than vendor B. Next to this, while they are getting money for these repositories and people are willing to pay even more money to get better support, maybe from time to time they even do, next to the security fixes in their closed repositories, fixes for individual issues that customers have. And based on this, the differences between those Java versions, or first of all repositories, and then on the builds that are depend on this, are becoming bigger. And this was a situation that was, from my point of view, quite critical for the Java ecosystem, because first of all, this means that we have Java versions that go into different directions and maybe have difference internally. And next to it, you are locked to a vendor and you need to pay for it. Because with the new release cycle, as we've seen, Oracle already does this fork into a closed repository after 6 months. And you as a company normally do not want to switch after 6 months your Java major version to a new version. Happily, there was a solution for this, because this was some time ago, like 2 years ago, quite a critical topic from my point of view. But there was a solution, because there are some vendors that contribute to the open source branches or versions directly at the OpenJDK. And the main vendor here is Red Hat, who's the maintainer of the Java 8 and Java 11 LTS branch in the OpenJDK. And what Red Hat is doing is they are fixing all the security fixes directly open source in those branches, which leads to a situation where in the OpenJDK, so in the open, we have for Java at the moment for Java 8 and for Java 11, and I assume the same will be for Java 17 in the future. We have open and free branches that will be updated with all the needed security fixes, and based on this, it's possible to build ATS versions for Java 8 and Java 11 out of the OpenJDK. So when we go back to the release train of Java, when having a look at the OpenJDK release train, you can see that this looks now much, much better than the one that we've seen earlier, because here everything is clean, everything is free, everything is open source. And this is a very important base for AdoptOpenJDK and what we are doing at AdoptOpenJDK, as George will see you later. So the situation that we might end in totally different Java versions isn't there anymore, based on companies, for example, like Red Hat, who committed to do things in the open source area, to not provide vendor logins for such a critical runtime as Java is today. Okay, so that's for the introduction of the OpenJDK and the workflows, and I will hand over to George, who will give an introduction to AdoptOpenJDK.
Thanks, Hendrik. So I'm hoping at this point everyone has a kind of a reasonable understanding, at least, of what the OpenJDK workflow looks like, what the possible vendors are out there. And at this point, we're going to suddenly become a lot more biased, and we're going to zoom straight into one particular vendor who, coincidentally, we both sit on the technical steering committee for. So AdoptOpenJDK, what is it and why? So to kind of answer that, I want to firstly just dive straight into the history of the project. Many people think it's quite a sort of recent project. It's actually not correct. It was founded in around 2003. At that point, it was a Java adoption group. And what that means is it was put together by several Java user groups and other members that commit to OpenJDK with the kind of sole purpose of enabling committers to get their patches into the OpenJDK stream. For those that haven't tried contributing to OpenJDK, it can be challenging. There's lots of sort of hoops that you have to jump through. You have to sign the OCA, the Oracle Contributor Agreement. And so this group was put together to help that. Now, zooming into 2016, IBM created a project called AdoptOpenJDK. Now, for those that are really familiar with the AdoptOpenJDK project, you may well still see the odd mention of AdoptOpenJDK. The idea behind all of this was that when we put together the project, we were able to provide a vendor-neutral binary that was built in an open source way where all of the code was available on GitHub. And we would be able to support as many different machines as possible. So all these different distributions and architectures. And we'll cover that later. So going into 2017, IBM donated AdoptOpenJDK into the adoption group. And I guess at this point, that's really where AdoptOpenJDK as we know it sort of was put together. Going another year forwards, we were growing pretty quickly. We hit 1 million downloads, which was a huge milestone for us. I don't think anybody expected it. And going forward another year again, you'll see we suddenly hit 30 million downloads. And actually, the more important bit here is that we had 23 sponsors. I say that's the most important bit because we were starting to get together with some of the biggest companies and other JVM vendors out there. And the kind of sole purpose of bringing all these companies together with a single vision under a single roof was starting to come together. Moving into 2020, well, there's two pretty exciting things. I think last week we announced that we hit 200 million downloads, which is just insane. I don't know if you can see the sort of flow here, but it's a pretty aggressive curve. A lot of people downloading our binaries. And also, really excitingly, AdoptOpenJDK has announced that it will join the Eclipse Foundation. So let's sort of dive straight into that. I'm hoping that everybody saw this this tweet go out. If they didn't, here it is. The kind of brief sort of summary of what we're doing here is we're planning to move the entire project into the Eclipse Foundation. Currently, the project is backed by the London Java community, which is doing it out, kind of out of their own kind heart, and we've been a bit of a burden to them. Really, we've kind of outgrown their support, and we need a more formalized foundation structure to continue that journey that we're taking today. So we went through all of the foundations out there. We even sort of looked at whether we could create our own foundation, and the Eclipse Foundation was a really good match for us at that point. It had a really good understanding of the Java ecosystem. There were lots of other projects already in that area. Of course, Jakarta EE had moved into the Eclipse Foundation, so it made a lot of sense for us to also follow. To kind of briefly summarize what that means for us, we'll be splitting the technical steering committee that Hendrik mentioned earlier into two key areas. We will have a PMC, a project management committee. They will handle the technical issues. They'll be looking at the kind of strategic roadmap of the project. And then we're also going to have a working group and steering committee. The working group is going to be there for companies to sign up to and become members. And the steering committee, the goal is to be able to allow those companies and those sponsors to have a say in what happens, where that money goes, and hopefully help us just grow the project even further. And it allows us to really have proper budgets for things like marketing, conferences. And so hopefully this is going to be a good move for us all. So I think next slide, please, Hendrik. Yeah, so why AdoptOpenJDK? The first thing is we are business-ready binaries. I know we mentioned earlier that we are a completely open source project, but we are powering some of the largest companies out there in the world now. They're using our binaries. We have a very broad platform coverage, if not the broadest platform coverage. We are seriously professionally tested. And I won't sort of go into that now because we've got some good slides on the testing that we do later. We have a really clear support policy. Anybody can go to our website and go to the support page, and it breaks down exactly what you can and can't do. We've tried to keep our binary as open and as free to use and free to consume as possible. We're backed by some of the most sort of the major vendors in the Java community. And I mentioned on the previous slide, we're already at 200 million downloads, which I think is a good sort of testimony to the project. As I mentioned, we're completely open and transparent. We have the technical steering committee that does everything in the open. The entire project is open source, so everything's in GitHub. We have a Slack channel with over 2,000 members on, where we discuss all of our roadmap items, where we discuss issues. And we like to kind of keep it that way. We don't want to have code and infrastructure locked away from people. We want to allow us to keep sort of going forward in this transparent manner. Next slide, please, Hendrik. So we're on to sort of building binaries now. So I just wanted to very quickly walk people through what a build and test pipeline looks like today. So when we kick off a build in our Jenkins instance, we get the OpenJDK variant source repo. We choose which branch to build from. Typically that's dev for us because we have a very small set of patches. Otherwise it's master. That then goes into our build, test, and deploy pipeline where it gets built in Jenkins. It gets tested and then it gets deployed out and are made available to all of our services such as our API, our website, Homebrew, Casks, all of those things. And the really interesting thing to add here is the red dots, sort of dashed line, represents approved third-party OpenJDK binaries. So for those that didn't realize, we recently started supporting the Red Hat provided upstream binaries, which are basically a reference implementation build. And they get put into our test pipeline at this stage and churned out just like any other binary. So they go through our entire test suite. Next slide, please, Hendrik. So I won't go into too much detail here. Hopefully most people have seen Jenkins. If they haven't, this is our Jenkins CI. Anybody can go to it. It's at ci.adoptopenjdk.net. I must admit, I was slightly naughty and I picked a very green set of builds. They're not always that green, but that's where everything happens. We have a folder structure where we have a folder for each version, and then we have an OS architecture combination for each job. So Linux on ARM, Linux on Intel, Linux on Power, and so forth. Next slide, please, Hendrik. So just to sort of quickly go into the supported VMs and supported platforms that we have. As I mentioned earlier, we have a really broad set of supported platforms. Things like Windows, Linux, Mac, the common ones, but we also do builds for things like Oracle, Solaris, Spark, and Solaris on Intel. We do mainframe builds for a whole set of things, so Power and Z-Linux, AIX. And we also support 2 different VMs at the moment. So we support Hotspot, which is the OpenJDK build that comes as part of the reference implementation. And we also support Eclipse OpenJ9, which is obviously a familiar project in the Eclipse Foundation. It's the open sourced version of the IBM J9 VM. So you can go and grab either one of those from our webpage. And I think I'm going to hand back to Hendrik now for test.
Okay. So, yeah, so we built a lot of different binaries for different platforms. The good thing is that everything happens in the open. As George mentioned, you can have a look at our Jenkins. You can have a look into the build. All the build scripts are available at GitHub. So based on this, you can even grab all the things and build an OpenJDK binary on your own and have your own Java runtime that is built on your machine and use it to run your software. To be true, you shouldn't do that because maybe something goes wrong. Maybe you do one of the build steps not correct, and therefore at the end you have maybe a runtime that is not working correctly. For AdoptOpenJDK, and not even for our builds, as George mentioned, for even other binaries, currently, for example, the Red Hat upstream binaries, so the kind of vanilla OpenJDK binaries, we have a lot of tests that are executed with each build. And to do so, next to our binaries, the build code, and so on, we have a tool which can be found in our GitHub organization that is called Aqua, and this is the test tool of AdoptOpenJDK, and it's used to test all the Java binaries. And when talking about testing, this is quite a large number. So you've seen that we have binaries for Windows, for Mac, for iX, for PowerPC. Then we provide hotspot. Then we provide OpenJ9. For OpenJ9, we even provide 2 different kinds of builds with normal or large heap. So this at the end means that we have kind of 58 different platforms where we build Java binaries on. And we do not just build, for example, Java 11. We have builds for Java 8. We have builds for Java 11, for all the other Java versions that are currently out there, like Java 15 at the moment. And we even have builds for some specific feature branches. I don't know, for Valhalla or Loom, I think we have currently some specific builds. And all those builds, for all those builds, we execute tests. There are currently around 250,000 tests that were executed. So, and this means that for a release or for a Nighty build, we execute like 87 million tests. When having such a huge amount of tests, for example, in a Nighty, you need to take care of having parallel tests here, doing things asynchronously, and so on, because otherwise, I mean, with this count of tests, right, it wouldn't be a Nighty, it would be a, I don't know, monthly if you don't do it in parallel, for example. And this is something where the Aqua test suite takes care of. So the Aqua test suite defines 6 different groups for tests, and the groups will be executed in parallel. And this happens in parallel for all the different binaries. And the groups, as you can see, there are OpenJDK, functional, system, external, perf, and JCK. So so all these groups contain different kind of tests. Let's have an example here. The OpenJDK, for example, contains tests that are coming from the OpenJDK. The perf contains some performance tests. There was about 80 benchmarks in it to check that the current build is still performant enough. Another thing which is quite interesting is the external group that contains around 125,000 test cases. And they come from external frameworks and applications. So we have from 5 microprofile TCKs, for example, all the tests in it. We have all the tests from Tomcat in it. We have all the tests from Derby in it. And we execute those tests on the binaries to see that the binaries are still running. Let's have an example how this looks for Derby. So what Aqua does it when he runs the tests, it creates a Docker container and copies the JDK that we want to test, so the JDK that we just built, into this Docker container, then checks out the Derby repository into the container, builds Derby, and then based on our JDK that we want to test, it executes all the Derby tests that are maybe even part of the build. And based on this, we can see if all those tests are still running with our build JDK. And yeah, what Aqua then does, it collects all those tests results and put them together so that at the end you can see if all the tests are green or if there's some tests that have failed. So this is what we are doing in testing to create enterprise-ready binaries. And I think with this amount of tests, this is really a quite cool number. Okay, as George already mentioned, we have a lot of sponsors. So first of all, thank you to all the sponsors that allow us to create the binaries and work in the AdoptOpenJDK project. But it's not only the sponsors. The most important part is the community. So the people that work on the project, some as part, since they are working for a company that is sponsor, so as part of the company, but there are a lot of people who work in their free time on the project because they want to learn how to build Java, they want to keep Java open, and so on. So I think we do not have that much time. I don't know if there are any questions.
We're on the hard wall, unfortunately, Hendrik. I believe that's it.
But anyway, so if there are any questions, you can just ping us on Slack or on Twitter at AdoptOpenJDK or at GDMs_ or at Hendrik Ebbers, and just ask us questions there. So I hope you like the presentation. I hope you like AdoptOpenJDK. Maybe you already use it today or now want to switch to it to have your Java-based environment and system even in the future open and free. I think that's it. If there are not any questions. Oh, we are out. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Good.